Welcome. Even though I was here to be introduced for marriage, the first thing my future mother-in-law, Janet, said surprised me. What? I responded in confusion, thinking I must have heard wrong. Janet looked at me with a mean smile and said, "Oh, you're not the maid? You have such a plain-looking face." Paul, the man I thought was on my side, betrayed me by laughing along. "You're right, she does have a poor-looking face. I wonder what her parents look like," he said. Janet and Paul kept insulting me and even looked down on my parents. I couldn't take it anymore, so I secretly messaged my father. He replied quickly, saying he would come right away. I excused myself, saying I needed fresh air, unable to listen to Paul's cruel comments any longer. "Don't run away," Paul shouted with a laugh as I left. 30 minutes later, I introduced my father, Timothy, to Paul and Janet. "Here's the maid's father," Paul said mockingly. But when my father stepped in, Janet's face froze. She recognized him right away. "I'm Teresa, and I'm turning 28 this year. I work at a small company and have always lived my life trying to blend in. I keep my makeup simple, usually just foundation, and prefer wearing navy or black clothes. I don't wear contacts and instead stick to thick glasses because of my strong prescription. The reason I keep such a low profile is that my father is well known. He's an actor, and even though he usually plays supporting roles, he's often on TV and is moderately famous. Growing up with him as my father wasn't always easy. In middle school, classmates would ask for his autograph, and their parents wanted to meet him. Since I refused, I got criticized and even faced bullying from jealous classmates. I didn't want to cause any trouble for my father, and I hated the idea of people thinking I was showing off. So, I dressed plainly and chose a high school where no one knew me. My last name is common, so I was able to live normally from then on. Because of my plain appearance, men didn't approach me, and I enjoyed a peaceful student life, spending time happily chatting about comics with my friends. I met my fiancé Paul after I started working. Paul worked for the leasing company that provided the copy machine for the company where I worked. We didn't interact much, just exchanging a few words when he came to check the machine. Everything changed the day the copy machine broke. I was busy preparing materials for an important meeting the next day, and I needed the machine to work. When it stopped, I panicked and called Paul. He came quickly and checked the machine. "Can it be fixed?" I asked, worried. He smiled and said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." I fell in love with that smile right then. Even though the machine couldn't be fixed, Paul arranged for a replacement, and I was able to prepare everything in time. After that, I made an effort to get closer to Paul. I got his contact information, called him often, and eventually confessed my feelings. We started dating, and Paul was always kind and considerate. He never seemed angry, and I thought he would stay that way, even after learning about my father. So, after 2 months of dating, I proposed to Paul, and he happily accepted. I remember being so happy. But there was one thing that bothered me: my appearance. I've always worn thick glasses, even on dates, and dressed plainly. It's just a habit I couldn't break. I look a lot like my father, with strong features, and because of my looks, I was often envied by girls in middle school and judged by boys. It wasn't easy, but I thought Paul wouldn't care. I planned to change my appearance little by little for him. However, after we got engaged, I started feeling uneasy. Before, Paul was always kind, but recently he started making comments that made me feel small. One day, we went to a bridal fair to choose a wedding venue. Paul suggested the place, and it was very fancy, a luxurious guest house for a big wedding with over 50 guests. I felt uncomfortable because I don't have many friends and didn't want a big event. I had hoped for a small, simple wedding. I wanted to leave right away, but Paul seemed to enjoy the place, so I stayed quiet and just went along. After it was over, we went to a cafe, and Paul was in a great mood. "That wedding venue was beautiful, wasn't it?" he said. "I prefer something even more extravagant," Paul said while sipping his coffee. Hearing this, I felt anxious because it seemed like he really wanted the fancy venue we had visited earlier. I decided to speak up about my feelings. I was thinking maybe a small wedding with just the two of us would be nice. "I don't like standing out," I said, hoping Paul would understand and compromise. But his response shocked me. Paul looked at me and laughed mockingly. Of course, a plain girl like you wouldn't fit in at a place like that. There's probably no dress that goes with those thick glasses of yours, he said. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He continued, my family is wealthy, and not having a grand wedding would be embarrassing. I was speechless. The kind Paul the First had known was now talking down to me like a completely different person. Before I could process it, he added, you should just be quiet and do as I say. A plain woman like you should be grateful to be getting married at all. His harsh words left me stunned and scared. Then, with a smile, Paul said, I'll handle everything. You just need to follow along, okay? I didn't know how to respond, so I forced a smile. Deep down, I started wondering if getting engaged to Paul was a mistake. But it felt too late to back out. I had already told our families and my workplace about the engagement. Despite everything, a part of me still loved Paul and hoped he would go back to being the kind person he was before. So, even though I was confused and hurt by his behavior, I continued with engagement. Paul's hurtful comments didn't stop, and each one wounded me more. But I couldn't bring myself to hate him. Every time I thought about ending the relationship, I remembered the kind Paul the First used to know, and I couldn't let go. I still loved him, despite everything. One day, things became even more confusing. Paul and I had finally decided on a wedding venue. After visiting several places, Paul chose the luxurious guest house we saw first. With pride, he said, a lavish ceremony really suits me. Too bad for you, though. And he laughed, hurting me again. As we headed to the guest house to finalize the paperwork, my heart felt heavy. I ran into someone. Oh, is that you, Paul? A woman called out. Mom, what are you doing here? Paul looked surprised when he saw her. Then he introduced us. Teresa, this is my mom, Janet. Mom, this is Teresa, my fiancé. Remember, I told you I was getting married. Janet smiled at me. I'm Paul's mother. You seem like a serious person. Where do you work? You must be at a big company, right? This was my first time meeting Paul's mom, so I nervously told her about my job, explaining that I do clerical work. Janet's expression changed, looking puzzled. I've never heard of that company, she said. Paul stepped in to explain. Teresa's company is one of my sales clients. It's small, only about 65 employees, so it makes sense you would know it. Upon hearing that, Janet's face darkened. I thought since you were Paul's fiancé, you'd be working at a more well-known company. Doesn't that mean your salary is low? Are you planning to make Paul suffer? I felt embarrassed and apologized, saying, I'm sorry. My salary isn't very high. Janet sighed heavily. Can you at least not rely entirely on Paul? Our family comes from a respected background. We don't need a woman with an unclear origin, you know? I was confused and tried to respond, but Janet kept going. What about your parents? They must work for reputable companies, right? She glared at me. As I was about to answer nervously, my eyes drifted to her bag, and I noticed something familiar. I fell silent. Seeing this, Paul stepped in again. Come on, Mom, calm down. We're visiting soon to make the formal marriage introductions, remember? Fine, but I'm not really in the mood to welcome anyone, Janet replied, still glaring at me. My first impression on her had clearly been bad, and I couldn't help but sigh quietly. The road to marriage seemed very tough. Then came the day for the official marriage introduction. As I stood in front of Paul's family home, I couldn't help but whisper, wow. The house was even more grand than I had imagined. Since Janet had mentioned their family's wealth, I expected it to be impressive, but this was beyond anything I'd thought. The gate was automatic, there was an elevator inside, and there were 7 luxury cars parked outside. It was unbelievable. Paul spoke up. Dad's at work today, so it's just Mom. Make yourself comfortable, he said with a smile, but I felt nervous. Janet had been harsh to me before, and I was sure she'd make more sarcastic remarks. We entered the living room, where Janet was waiting. Hello. Thank you for the other day, I said cautiously. I greeted Janet politely, but the next moment she said something unbelievable. Welcome, maid. Even though she knew I was there for a marriage introduction, that was the first thing she said. What? I replied in confusion. thinking I must have misheard. Janet gave me a mean smile. Oh, you're not the maid? You've got such a poor-looking face. I was shocked. How could she say something so cruel? Then Janet laughed, clearly enjoying herself. Paul told me it's okay to treat you like a maid. It seems like Paul just wanted to marry someone who would do whatever he says. Paul, what do you mean? I asked, my face going pale. I wanted to believe this was just a bad joke. But the man I thought was on my side betrayed me in the worst way. Paul glanced at my face and burst out laughing. You're right, Mom. She does have a poor-looking face. I'd love to see her parents. Maybe we could use them as servants too, he said, laughing crudely. Having someone obedient for free sounds nice, but if they come to a wealthy house like ours, I wonder if Teresa's parents would faint from the shock, Janet added, continuing to look down on me. Then, Janet asked mockingly, by the way, what does your father do? He's not homeless, is he? Before I could respond, Paul burst into laughter again. Mom, that's not a real job. With Teresa being like this, it's clear her dad doesn't have a stable career, he said, laughing so hard his stomach hurt. Janet and Paul kept making fun of my parents, assuming we were uneducated and poor just because of how I looked. I clenched my teeth in frustration. They were being incredibly rude, not only to me, but also to my family. I couldn't take it anymore. While Janet and Paul weren't paying attention, I quickly sent a message to my father. I need you to come now, I wrote, and sent him the address Paul had given me for the marriage introduction. I knew today was my father's day off, so he was likely at home relaxing. Luckily, within a minute, my father replied, I'm on my way. Seeing his reply, I felt a sense of relief. Then I turned to Paul and Janet and said, I'm feeling a bit unwell, so I'm going to get some fresh air. I couldn't listen to their cruel remarks any longer. I had to leave. I thought I would wait outside quietly until my father arrived. Oh, is that so? Well then, Paul, why don't we continue our tea? Janet said, happy to be alone with him. Teresa, don't run away. Paul laughed crudely as I left. I stepped outside and waited for my father. 30 minutes later, my father arrived, wearing dark sunglasses. Teresa, what's wrong? Today was supposed to be your marriage introduction, right? He asked, surprised to see me upset. Seeing him, I felt a wave of relief and started crying. I had tried to hold back, but the tears just wouldn't stop. What's wrong, Teresa? My father asked, panicking when he saw me cry. I explained everything the way Paul had changed after we got engaged, and how Janet had joined him in mocking me. I can't forgive them for looking down on you without knowing anything, I said through my tears. My father listened silently, but I could tell he was getting angry. Then I mentioned something about Janet that made my father laugh. He took off his sunglasses and handed them to me. We're going in now. I'll make sure they regret hurting you, he said. His words gave me the strength I needed. My love for Paul had turned to hatred, and I had made up my mind. We were going to make them regret it. I put on my father's sunglasses, and together we walked back into Paul's family home. I stood in front of Paul and Janet, my father by my side. Sorry to keep you waiting, I said, standing firm. Janet, who had been laughing when I left, was now stunned seeing me with my father. Why are you wearing sunglasses all of a sudden? She asked, confused. But when she saw who was beside me, her expression changed. She was frozen, clearly shocked. Janet had probably expected me to return and continue being humiliated, but that wasn't going to happen. My father looked directly at Janet and said calmly, I'm the maid's father. Though his voice was calm, his eyes showed no kindness, and his handsome face looked even more intimidating. Janet, recognizing my father, was visibly shaken. How could this be? Why is Timothy here? Is this some kind of surprise? She asked, her cheeks turning red and her voice trembling. Her eyes sparkled like a young girl's as she looked at him, while Paul stood there, completely clueless. My father didn't answer Janet's questions. He just stared at them, making Janet blush under his gaze, which was a bit embarrassing for a woman of her age. I looked at Janet coldly. Paul, still confused, asked, Timothy? Mom, is he a friend of yours? It was clear Paul didn't know who my father was. He's famous among Janet's generation, but younger people like Paul might not recognize him unless they watch TV dramas. Janet glared at Paul. Paul, how rude. This man is a famous actor and my first love. Paul looked shocked, not believing what he just heard. Janet then turned to my father with a smile. I'm a big fan of yours, Timothy. Look. She pulled out a keychain from her purse. This can only be bought by fan club members. I've been a fan for over 15 years. Janet was gushing with admiration, clearly excited to meet her favorite actor. Mom, Paul said, looking embarrassed by Janet's sudden change in behavior. She kept talking to my father, her mood lifted by his presence. But my father's expression remained serious. Finally, after staying silent, my father spoke. I understand that you're a fan of mine, but did you really treat my daughter, Teresa, like a maid? Janet, who had been so cheerful, went pale and froze, visibly trembling. Ignoring her reaction, my father continued, and you assumed I was homeless without even meeting me. That's very rude. His glare made Janet even more panicked. No, I didn't know Teresa was your daughter. We'd be happy to have you in our family, right, Paul? She said, turning to him. Paul, now nervous, quickly agreed. Yes, of course. Janet then tried to justify herself. I didn't mean it. If I had known, I would have behaved better. Teresa is wonderful, and she looks so much like you. I was just jealous, afraid of losing my son. Watching Janet desperately trying to change her tone after insulting me and my father earlier, I realized she wasn't being sincere. She was only acting this way because of who my father is. I couldn't let this continue. It was my problem to deal with, not my father's. I took a deep breath and told Janet, I'm breaking off the engagement with Paul. So, there's no chance you'll become family with my dad. What? Teresa, please don't. This is my chance to be part of Timothy's family. Please reconsider. Janet pleaded, her face almost in tears. But after how terribly she had treated me, I couldn't trust her tearful act. I looked at her coldly. Janet, still thinking she could convince me, smiled weakly. You want to marry Paul, don't you? She asked. But I wasn't going to be swayed. I won't fight it anymore. It's okay. I'll do anything for you. Janet begged, clinging to me, desperate to become part of my father's family. Her sudden willingness to do anything was the complete opposite of how she had acted earlier. I felt disgusted by how easily she changed her stance. I muttered softly, No, thank you. What? What did you say? Janet asked, tilting her head as if she hadn't heard me. This time, I said it louder. I absolutely do not want to be family with you. Janet looked shocked by my words. I finally let out all the feelings I had been holding back. You insulted me the moment you found out about my job, and you talked terribly about my father. I can't forgive that. I made my stance clear, but instead of responding to me, Janet turned to my father, realizing she couldn't convince me. She smiled at him and said, Timothy, don't you want our daughter to be happy? We're a wealthy family, and she'd be happy with us. Some people think happiness comes from money, but not me. Sensing my feelings, my father spoke up. Teresa values love more than money. And besides, we're not lacking in wealth. I'm an actor, and I earn more than enough. Janet was stunned, unable to come up with a response. My father is a well-known actor, regularly appearing in dramas, and our family has never struggled financially. There was no reason for me to marry just for money. Janet fell silent, likely realizing she had no good argument left. Then my father continued, You claim to be a fan of mine, but I can't stand someone who mistreats my daughter. Please don't call yourself my fan anymore. He glared at Janet, and she burst into tears. If Timothy hates me, I can't go on living, she sobbed uncontrollably. Until then, Paul had been quiet, but he finally spoke up. You've said a lot, Teresa. You'll regret breaking off our engagement. No one else will want someone like you. Paul sneered. Wait, Paul. Janet, concerned about my father's opinion, tried to stop him, but Paul continued. I picked someone plain like you, because I thought you'd be obedient. I was planning to cheat on you with prettier girls after we got married. It's annoying that my plan won't work anymore. Hearing Paul reveal his true intentions, I realized there had never been any love from him. He just wanted someone he could control. My love for Paul had already faded, and now it was completely gone. Paul kept making selfish remarks, clearly unaware of how much he had hurt me. My father looked furious, ready to confront Paul, but I stopped him. "Dad, wait." I smiled calmly, still wearing my sunglasses. "What's going on?" Paul asked, a bit thrown off by my calm smile. "Do I still look plain to you?" I asked, then took off my sunglasses with a flourish. Paul froze, staring at my face. It wasn't surprising I had put on makeup after meeting with my father and crying earlier. I usually only wore foundation, but this time I added eyeshadow, mascara, and eyeliner. I had done my makeup after crying when I saw my father, and even though it was just eye makeup, it changed my look a lot. "Is that really you, Teresa?" Paul's face turned a little red, clearly taken by my makeup-enhanced appearance. "Yes, it's me. I've always played down my looks to avoid attention, but I've decided to stop hiding," I said. Until now, I had tried to stay low-key because of the attention my father's fame brought, but after being insulted by Paul and Janet, I realized it was okay to stand out a little and show my true self. Paul, still blushing, said, "If you'd looked like this from the start, I would have been nicer to you. We can still start over. Let's get engaged again, and maybe you could introduce me to some actresses through your dad." The fact that he even suggested continuing the engagement just for his selfish gain shocked me. I made my position clear. The engagement is over. I don't need someone like you in my life anymore. And I'll cancel the wedding venue, too. "What?" Paul was stunned. But I wasn't done. "You'll also be covering the cancellation fee for the wedding venue. That's only fair." Janet, confused, exclaimed, "Wait, it's too much to pay for all of it." Paul, looking lost, didn't know how to respond. Then my father spoke with a calm smile. "Why not have Paul's father cover it? With all those luxury cars, it shouldn't be a problem." I played my final card. "If you're not happy with this, we can go to court. But remember, my father is a famous actor, and his extreme fans might not take kindly to this. They might retaliate. My father has many loyal fans, and a critic who once insulted him had faced severe consequences: prank calls, threatening letters, and worse. It even made the news." Remembering that, Janet's face turned pale. She quickly urged Paul, "Paul, you need to pay the cancellation fees. We can't risk it." Paul finally seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation. "Are you kidding me?" he said, falling to his knees in despair. "I don't need you in my life," I said, turning to my father. "Dad, let's go home." We left, ignoring the defeated Paul and Janet behind us. I left the place with my father, and the engagement with Paul was officially over. Paul ended up having to pay the full cancellation fee for the wedding venue. It turns out that my father-in-law is the head of a company, and my father had once appeared in a commercial for that company. Because of this connection, my father told him about Paul and Janet's behavior. My father-in-law, who didn't know what had happened, was furious. He confronted Paul and Janet harshly and insisted that Paul pay the full cancellation fee. This left Paul with a heavy financial burden. Janet also faced consequences. My father-in-law filed for divorce. Their mistreatment of us wasn't the only reason, though. Janet had a habit of wasting money, especially on fan activities for my father, using my father-in-law's money. It seems my father-in-law had already grown tired of Janet's behavior. My father also revealed that Janet had sent him inappropriate love letters, saying things like, "I want to divorce my husband and marry you, Timothy. My current husband is just a source of money." This enraged my father-in-law, and despite Janet's resistance, the divorce was finalized with the help of lawyers. I heard rumors that Janet was living in regret, crying and saying, "This wasn't supposed to happen." She was also kicked out of my father's fan club due to her troublesome behavior as a fan. It seemed like karma had caught up with her. I couldn't imagine her finding happiness after losing everything, but it was the result of her actions. 2 months later, something even more surprising happened. Paul was arrested. He had started stalking me. After I removed my sunglasses that day, Paul became obsessed with me. He frequently appeared in front of my house, even after I quit my job. He would call me often, begging me to reconsider the engagement and crying, saying, "I need you, no one else will do." But I knew he was only fixated on my looks. He had only become interested after seeing me with makeup. I didn't need a man who judged people by their appearance, so I politely refused and blocked his calls. Unfortunately, Paul's actions got worse. I had to consult the police several times to handle the situation. I felt unsafe, and after a lot of thought, I decided to file a report with the police. My father agreed it was the right thing to do. Eventually, Paul was arrested for trying to force his way into our house. After his arrest, Paul lost his job. Now, all he has left is a large amount of debt, and it's unlikely he'll be able to live a normal life. It's the consequence of looking down on others for so long. Since then, I've started working as my father's manager. The job is much more demanding than my previous clerical position. I now handle his schedule, go with him to events, make introductions, and negotiate salaries. Before, I just went between the office and home, barely talking to people and mostly working on the computer. Now, meeting and talking to people is a big part of my job, and it's very different from what I was used to. However, I find it incredibly rewarding. Being a manager can seem like a glamorous job, but it's about more than that. I'm there to support my father behind the scenes, so he can focus on his acting career. The hours are irregular and the job requires flexibility, but I love being able to work closely with him. I want to make up for all the stress I caused him and do my best in this new role. Even though I'm still new to this, and there will be challenges ahead, I'm determined to keep moving forward and give it my all for my father. Every day, I work hard, standing by his side.